Hey everyone, this is a demo debate and training session on the open semifinal of USUDC this year. The motion reads, this house opposes the prominence of Hollywood morality. We'll start with a PMLO exchange on the motion, and then we'll talk in further depth about our reasoning for placement and other strategic and content notes on the motion. Using hard side constraints is no coherent way to live life. Two pieces of framing. One, the natural alternative to Hollywood morality is one where media more strongly portrays characters actually exacting revenge. On top of that, it probably includes portrayals of utilitarianism being good, lying to people around you, or making sacrifices for others, such as innocence, for the greater good, such as Batman engaging in mass surveillance to stop the Joker in The Dark Knight. And more broadly, to do this, you probably get a greater prominence of anti heroes in media, heroes who are relatively more morally complex and willing to make those sacrificial decisions for overall positive outcomes. Secondly, there is a trend in debating of arguing that X piece of media is a countervailing force against other pressures in life, like selfish impulses or schools teaching morality anyway. Different people are to different degrees affected by these forces. This debate is more realistically about the average person who is exposed to those pressures in both directions, so neither OO nor back half can run those arguments. Two claims. Firstly, why this is better for people's lives. The relevant burden to start with is who views this media and most strongly internalizes this media? The answer is children. When children are young, they form parasocial relationships with people they see in the media in a way that adults do not. They have imaginary friends. They try to imitate people they see in the media at home and at school. And on top of that, children and even teens are relatively more impressionable than adults. Their brains are not fully developed yet, whereas adults tend to be a bit more logical, so this media has less of an effect on their behavior. And the margin of this media and its effect on children is pretty significant. Remember, this Hollywood media is consumed by very large numbers of people around the globe, and it's multiple pieces of media that children consume for years at a time, which means it nudges children in particular moral directions. Given that, there are three ways that we improve the lives of children. Firstly, on conflict resolution strategies. The problem with Hollywood morality is that it asks too much. It asks kids not to respond to reasonable enough threats that they're presented with when in difficult situations. And the way that this maps onto conflict resolution in kids' lives is that kids may, for example, wait too long to respond to bullies at school when those bullies constantly make snide remarks to you. They may, for example, wait too long to confront someone about rumors that had been circulating about them. And this is horrible for kids because it creates a lot of emotional trauma in the interim. You're younger, you're sensitive, each emotional experience feels particularly novel. So when you're made fun of in even relatively subtle ways, that has a terrible long-term effect on your self-esteem. But secondly, sometimes these conflicts are just due to misunderstandings that on their side you don't preemptively resolve, such as gossip and the game of telephone creating miscommunications between two parties. Maybe someone is just being mean to you because of misinformation that they had heard. And on the comparative, we encourage more proactive types of responses to this behavior. Why is that? Because when we depict characters being more willing to respond to these threats, that also maps onto how kids are willing to respond. You talk to someone at signs of being mistreated initially rather than waiting. And I know what Op is going to say. Kids are young and immature, so if they're told to be proactive, they'll do this in bad ways. They don't know how to be proactive in smart ways. But this is unlikely because the point of this media is for it to act as a model for kids being proactive in relatively more smart and strategic ways. What this might look like is characters justifying to third parties why they are being proactive. I need to be proactive so that this villain doesn't go stronger later down the line. But let's say that's untrue, and kids do internalize our moral messaging poorly. Hollywood morality is still bad because if on both sides of this debate, kids are likely to internalize the moral codes in media in bad ways, they will also internalize Hollywood morality in bad ways, meaning that they, for example, wait too long to respond to a bully, even when they are experiencing significant amounts of distress. That leads to a lot of emotional repression. Anger boils up. It takes a significant psychological toll on children. What is the implication of that? When it weighs on you so heavily for such a long period of time, you probably snap anyway. So on both sides, you're going to respond to a threat. But on their side, the response is way, way worse because it's months of resentment versus being relatively more proactive, even if you snap in the moment. So the conflict gets resolved sooner, even if parents or school teachers need to intervene. Secondly, even if kids more commonly seek revenge against others on our side, we're happy to take a hard stance that this is good because it creates creates deterrence against bad behavior. When you, for example, might go and attack a kid, but you now think, oh, that kid might actually defend themselves and push me back if I try to push them into a locker, you're preemptively less likely to do this. They might say this emboldens bullies at school, but that's untrue because on both sides, bullies or other aggressors will not be too concerned with acting morally. The meaningful difference is for kids in relatively weaker situations now feeling emboldened to stick up for themselves at school. But thirdly, on our side, people just behave in relatively more utilitarian rather than deontological ways. Now, this principle is not contingent because Ott must concede that people must act upon hard side constraints more commonly, like not sacrificing others for their case to work. And the reason that deontology is not a coherent moral framework is the following. One, it does not have a clear answer to competing moral obligations that people have. What do you do when, for example, you're not supposed to lie to people because that's a hard side constraint, but then a murderer comes to your door and asks where someone is? But secondly, deontology is circular. It says that things, you shouldn't do things because they can't be universalized. But why does that matter? Because it makes the world worse? That's rule utilitarianism. So deontology collapses into utilitarianism. In real terms, people act in more utilitarian ways, but that's good. Kids are more willing to lie to their friends, but that preserves the emotional well-being of third parties who are now less self-conscious as a result of the moral codes that we promote versus the moral codes that OP promotes. Second argument is also just that we tell better stories and the internalization of moral codes is better on our side of the house. Two key observations beneath this argument. One, we get deeper character development on our side of the house. Why? Because with Hollywood morality, the trajectory for moral development of main characters, are focused on in the media far more on their side of the house, is much more narrow. Maybe Peter Parker still thinks about revenge without exacting it, but the moral message is not as deep. He's never willing to actually push the envelope. But what's the issue? On our side of the house, you actually get characters who maybe exact revenge and then wrestle with difficult questions like how to forgive themselves or whether that was a good thing to do. So the scope for moral development is far larger. Why is that a good thing? Because kids are going to mess up. They're not going to be perfect human beings. They're not going to adhere perfectly on either side to Hollywood morality, even if they do it more on op side of the house. Why does that matter? On our side, when we have media that more directly corresponds to kids' experiences, they resonate with it more and therefore have a better takeaway from the moral message that's being spent by the media in the first place. And that just provides a significant emotional benefit to these kids who feel like they can relate to the main characters in these shows and feel less alone. But also, there's just a wider landscape of moral messages we can send on our side of the house. In many cases, historically marginalized groups, for example, can't conform to very significant or hard side constraints. They need to exact revenge. They need to defend themselves to a more significant extent. And on our side, we create more room to have films like Gone Girl, which highlight sexism. Maybe they do so in a relatively dark way, but it also means that you're catering to groups who are put in these difficult positions, whereas on their side of the house, they get more majoritarian media, which doesn't resonate with as many kids.
Okay, great. Starting in three, two, one, go. Before I talk about the impact on young viewers and the principle, let's be clear on the counterfactual. The counterfactual is not complex depictions of morality or discussions between different characters on why they did it or wrestled with it, but instead it's far more likely to be flashbang, dramatic kind of art that's very simple. This looks like, for example, being slightly excessively nihilistic or just showing, for example, the vengeance, like in a movie, say, like Django Unchained, that shows beautiful colors of blood when they have people being killed, but not necessarily the deep moral complex relations of people behind that. Why is our counterfactual likelier than the others? The first is because in many instances, to try and talk about those kind of characters with that level of complexity without sounding false or making people think that it's a bad movie is often really deep and difficult to do, which often means that artists feel they have to spend a lot more time trying to create it. But more importantly, even if they create it well, film studios are really worried about preemptively trying to create that kind of wrestling with art because one, they're not certain if each and every single person will buy into that entire depiction or understanding of deep complexity of morality. So what they prefer are the kind of media that's very simple and entertaining, that doesn't go into the long discussion of people wrestling with themselves because it's not like it doesn't look very good, right? It's like walk down the street, talk to a couple of people. Instead, it's far easier to go for like the shooting of the gun and killing people in many instances. The only thing that stops that is to preemptively give conditions on what is allowed to be entertaining, which is what Hollywood morality by definition does anyways. This cuts out a lot of the extent of like introspection or understanding deep complex morality that they are already going for. The second thing I want to talk about are the viewers themselves and how this is harmful for them. The first claim is that this often has or taps into an excessive preponderance of vengeance that these kids have on their side. Now, it is true. Maybe for older individuals, there are a variety of competing ones. But for younger people, the first and foremost thing they're feeling are the emotions they're unable to regulate. Their internal biological hormones that often have a preponderance for doing things like making them angry or making them happy, because that is seen as the best defense mechanism in a world that often can be unfriendly to them, right? They don't have the logical experience when they're 10 years old to understand the world and understand all of its context, which means people often, or these kids often have a lot of anger they're unable to control, which means the alternative of moral complexity, even if that is the counterfactual, is pretty bad at teaching those moral lessons to those kids. They cannot take away that nuance. They may just latch onto that flashy act of revenge. What is the simplistic standard that a kid can strive towards do? The first thing you can do is help better with conflict. Now, we say that instead of escalating into conflicts that can make you feel unsafe, it can make you indulge in resolutions that is possible. This is obviously Gov's same impact as well. But let's be very clear here. The first thing to say compared to Gov cases, you still experience trauma and anger on both sides of the house from that bully telling the bad word towards you. But on their side, you're more likely to follow it up with a punch as opposed to be proactive and like reach out to people and indulge in these rumor like mitigations. Why? First, it's very hard to map onto your own lives how Han Solo did it with his, precisely because the stories themselves are so radically different and confusing. So you don't know which person to reach out to stop the rumors. You're not even sure if you're going to be believed, because the very reason the rumors started about you is because you are a vulnerable person who was very easy to bully in the first place, in your point of view. But secondly, many times those stories they talk about are not very entertaining in and of themselves. Now, Gov's response to this is that you can often see characters as really deep, right? Like it's very easy to forgive yourselves, and that is moral development. That moral development can happen on both sides, right? Like you can still have questions over, is this the right choice? Why is it so emotionally hard to do? And then reach at the conclusion, yes, it is the right choice with Hollywood morality. That complexity is symmetric. But the kind of complexity that's asymmetric is the kind where you have to justify it in some instances to direct audiences, or more importantly, as my counterfaction prove, you don't have that conversation at all because it's not entertaining or fun enough from the studio head's point of view. So you cannot have that conversation in the first place because you don't think you know how to do so. And that means your first step is not like, reaching out to teachers or students or going to find the student who did the rumor and talking to them. It's far more likely in the moment of anger to punch them because the society and the movies have told you that it is justified in many instances to proactively do so. Notice on our side of the house, you can go to your teachers and ask them a lot more, because Hollywood morality would still say it's a perfectly proportional response when someone says a bad comment about you for you to tell the teacher about it, right? But Gov pushes the narrative against the incentive to tell teachers or friends or family or people who know and understand better about you about the problem. It instead says you ought to be fixing these issues yourself because your main hero in this cool movie fixed the issue by themselves. And in many instances, because of the incentives of Hollywood studios, it is to do it in the worst ways possible. That's what worsens violence and anger in the classroom and makes kids act in terrible ways. Whereas in the counterfactual, they would either reach out to the teachers or I'll be charitable. Maybe they don't reach out. Maybe they just feel the trauma. But at least the trauma is located to the internal turmoil of kids instead of actively exploding into violence between those kids, which crucially can often result in backlash against you, right? The bully can hit you back as well. That's pretty bad. So the other thing that it does, though, I feel it's generally good to not harbor hatred or seek revenge in your identity, but instead be more willing to forgive and be more emotionally intelligent. And it's often the main metric that reduces the incentives of people to become bullies. Gov's answer is a little flippant, like bullies are not concerned with being moral. I think they are. Many kids often think that they are being moral when they hit someone because they think that the perceived slight against them is justified in that reaction. You know the best way to stop this? By a clear, simple rule that says no matter what, you ought not punch them until they have punched you. You ought not say a bad word to them until they have said a bad word towards you. And crucially, this is the tipping point towards making them pretty happy, because sure, parents and teachers tell you this, but a cool, really fun movie that is setting aside a model for how a person should act, that's Gov's own mechanism to try and access their impacts. So we're using that same mechanism to say you are often efficacious in trying to have a bully preemptively look and understand another person instead of reaching out in hatred, which is the best mechanism to reduce the bullying before before it happens. That's the way that we are also winning this debate. But even if the morality stuff is contingent, because I think this is the way the debate likely looks out, let's look at the principle itself. I want to be clear here. On their side of the house, people are pretty bad arbiters of utilitarianism because it's very hard to judge the pragmatic consequences of when an action ends, of what the consequences of that action are, and the context behind people's lives. We don't want individuals to decide on their own when they are personally involved. On our side of the house, deontology leads to impractical decisions sometimes. I agree. In those instances, people can choose to discard when it isn't working for them. But on their side of the house, you constantly try to use utilitarianism, even when it doesn't fit, even when you don't know all the context, even if you don't know all the right set of consequences could be happening, which means on their side of the house, people could just be feeling worse before they actually indulge in an action. But at worst, they often indulge in the wrong utilitarian action to take. On our side, the clear rules is what makes them feel a lot happier practically, even whether the principle, whether it's right or wrong, is not important. It helps kids feel a lot better. It improves their conflict resolution. Oppose.
All right, so now we'll get into the motion training. I'll briefly start by explaining our reasoning for the placement on the motion and some strategic notes on the motion, and then I'll go into possible CG case lines that could exist, at least in this demo debate that happened, and Pranav will talk a bit more about CO. So in terms of placement, we had two broad reasons for putting Hollywood morality in the open semi. The first is that we felt a lot of the depth that exists on Hollywood morality is most accessible in very strong rooms, which would exist in an open semifinal that may not exist in preliminary rounds with weaker or middle rooms, because it may be relatively more difficult to access arguments beyond the intuitive ones. So, for example, some of the depth that we expected was further development of either moral principle or of really like precise and complex analysis about likely alternatives that emerge in the absence of this media, such as a stronger focus on nihilism, even if it's not the intuitive alternative of just, encourage people to seek out revenge more commonly. The second reason is because naturally, USUDC usually has a US politics motion in the final. Those topics tend to be harder topics, and we wanted to follow that tradition. Similarly, we wanted a finance motion as a weed out in the quarterfinal. So to balance out the two hard topics and in outs and to ensure that teams better at hard topics weren't over rewarded, we also needed a softer motion specifically in the semifinal. So what is this motion testing? I would say the biggest skill that it tests is teams' abilities to characterize. Can you prove why your counterfactual is the right one? Can you prove precisely how this media affects individuals' behavior, given many different forces that exist in individuals' lives that nudge people to act in certain ways, such as what they're told in school or their own impulses? The debate that we think is probably the most intuitive and realistic one is sort of the debate that happened that you just watched, which was this probably has the strongest effect on children and not adults, although there might be some room for teams to discuss how when children internalize these moral codes very heavily, they may bring those codes with them into adulthood. We just thought those impacts were a bit less realistic. So in terms of possible CG case lines, there are broadly five things that teams could discuss even after the PM that I gave. The first was there are reasonable arguments in the round that, alternative media, such as encouraging people to seek revenge, is actually an important countervailing force to other moral messaging that kids receive from, for example, their religions and their religious leaders or their teachers who tell them constantly not to lie in schools. Now, the reason that I included the framing about countervailing narratives arguments not working is because I just wanted to demonstrate what a relatively more strategic PM might look like to box out back half teams. And I also personally don't love running these types of arguments, but it certainly still is there, and closing is still allowed to present different characterizations. And there are ways to prove asymmetries on these arguments. So if you're making this argument from Gov, one thing you might say is, every day kids are told by their parents and their teachers not to lie. It's constant repetitive exposure to those moral codes. Whereas the selfish impulses that Ott might talk about that you may need to counteract by saying, don't seek revenge, also cancel out with empathetic impulses. So the relative need for a countervailing force against moral messaging, which says things like don't lie, is stronger than the relative need of a countervailing force against selfish impulses that you might have. The second possible CG line is further development of the moral argument I made toward the middle of my speech. So we think this is a big part of the built-in depth in the motion because deontology versus utilitarianism is its own debate with like 20 different arguments on either side. So one reasonable strategy from CG could be OO concedes that people behave on hard side constraints more commonly. Maybe OG gives two relatively limited reasons about why this is bad. We have far better and more well analyzed reasons. Chances are OG didn't have time to analyze this moral question in depth. So CG has a lot of room to say, here are our new reasons why deontology is bad, and here's why those new reasons are better than OG's reasons. And on top of that, here's why that's the most important issue in the debate, because it determines what's valuable and what we should care about. Thirdly, there's also more material on whether or not it's good for people to seek out revenge in the first place. Again, its own debate with a significant amount of depth. So, further development of this argument could look like talking about why seeking revenge in many cases can be empowering and good for your self esteem and your feeling of control over your own life. But maybe you won't be too extreme with it because there are natural penalties that exist for being too extreme anyway, like getting punished by your school. Fourthly, you could talk more about the types of writers and producers who get hired at media houses as a result of the norm being different. So it's similar to the argument that I made toward the end of my speech about writers being boxed into particular moral messages. But remember, it's not just about what moral messages do you send, it's also about who gets hired to send those moral messages. If you're more willing to, for example, create media which talks about different types of morality or which caters to different groups, that also presumably means that you're hiring different people to write that media because those people from marginalized backgrounds, for example, might have like relatively more of an ability to write compelling media selling that particular narrative. And then you can talk about why that's good. Um, Finally, there could be more direct engagement with other alternatives that exist in the round. So one really clever thing that Pranav did was reframe the debate and say, no, in fact, it could be a stronger focus on things like nihilistic media. So one way that CG could enter the debate is say, nihilistic media is actually good. Many individuals around the world feel extremely nihilistic because of things like mental health crises that people are experiencing, the male friendship recession. So when we depict more nihilism within media and send those kinds of messages, that increases engagement with media, which could be good for a number of reasons. It could provide more of an emotional benefit. It could mean that media houses are more well capitalized, and then they have a greater variety of media that they then uh, create and sell to people. So those are a series of different ways that you could approach the CG on this motion. Pranav, do you want to talk a bit more about CO?
Yeah, of course. Thanks. Yeah, so there are several, I think, possible CO lines. I think the first and simplest one is probably a much more thorough explanation of, well, I think the two different principles that exist. So one which is just more generally about deontology, something about like, you can talk about the content principle, something about why individual rights always ought to be respected over like collective rights. That I think would be, I think, a much better explanation than the one I gave, which I think just seemed to boil down to very utilitarian outcomes. Or second, you could just talk about like specifically the standard of retribution and why like that itself is a particularly problematic like philosophy. Some intuition pumps around like I don't know, we don't support torturers and that sort of stuff. That can be pretty helpful. The other few ideas that I can think of is one. I think there can be like a lot like more in-depth understanding of like a child's like depiction or like a child's understanding of like how they can use this to improve themselves. So to be more specific, right? I make like I hint at an argument about how like bullies like are more likely to become more emotionally intelligent or mature, but that argument I think is just like given in a line that really requires a lot more analysis. So think about it as similar to a narrative debate, maybe perhaps sort of like what is the kind of media that they would see, how does like the specific story impact their mind, once it impacts their mind to like relate to this situation, how is the situation somewhat analogous to what they might act like, and the action may not just even be towards other kids in schools. It may be to like family members or friends whom they already have in many instances. So like the general idea of like, not acting unless you've been hurt or like, like not being vengeful is often pretty important when it's utilized not just in like violent ways, but often in like much smaller interactions between your friends or with your family members. The third thing I think that it can be is sort of like when you talk about, say, for example, like you can talk, I think, about why this sort of art or media is just a lot more entertaining than others. So I think I sort of talk about it when I mention like moral complexity is something that can turn people off. But one, there is a lot more impacting to do around like how this harms, say, like the type of children's media that still gets funded or capitalized, or even in general, like what do adults react or look like when they get this kind of media, and if they see far less of it, how does that impact the ability for studios to make more media in general and that sort of stuff. um the other thing, or the I guess the fourth thing, I've sort of lost count, that you could be talking about a little bit is that I have like picked on the idea of like revenge being flashy, but I think there are other possible counterfactuals you can attempt to run which have different implications. So, for example, you could attempt to run that now, like society, like movies may just not think that it is important to bring morals at all, because if they can't tell a simplistic moral that is like very clearly elucidated, they will feel to they just ought make completely bland movies that don't attempt to tell messages or that are purely entertaining, which I think is a bit of a different message than like, just talking about the revenge aspect that creates violent movies. It might even be a bit more realistic. And there are different impacts to arise from that, right? Like either people like just turning off the television a lot more, or around how like, well, at least an argument I think is true in the real world, which is like people often like they watch a movie like going through the rote motions of like a traditional three-act plot structure, and then walk out of the movie feeling a bit dissatisfied or like, saddened or deadened, because they just feel like it wasn't trying to tell them anything deep or meaningful about their lives. So yeah, there are like, I think, I mean, there are probably like some more stuff to say, but I think that, these are just like an example of like a few types of arguments to run.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. See you in the next training.